the attentive and inquiring reader, I can't answer for the trolls and so on, should take some benefit, I believe, from this reflection on the concept of culture and its genesis, if you like. First, I give an anecdote of a moment that's always struck me as notable in the intellectual development of sort of modernity. I think sort of in Straussian terms, there's stages of modernity, and one of them has to do with the Hegel and the acceptance of the historical consciousness. The anecdote I want to give is on Herder. So I had occasion at one time and to read a book by Herder in an old library, not on this subject he's usually read for, like such as linguistics, but on straight out natural history, or as we now call it, biology. There's still people who still said, like if you go to the biosciences library on this UC Berkeley campus, they have tons of books called natural history, going even beyond the year 1900. Yeah, Herder. But this distinction is so unlike the distinction between alchemy and chemistry one has so much fun with. Instead, when I read that book, the thing that struck me as, if one could use the word in the British sense, is it's queer, or as sort of unheimlich, if you like, was that there was the priority, the pre-state before the notion of deep time and evolution had struck the author. That the author is writing as though he's doing biology, he's doing natural history, but he's writing as though with the same mentality of the biblical scholar, as it were, concerning the age of the earth, and then with the idea that all the animals must have just sort of shown up. Because I mean, it brings us immediately into imbecilism, even to try to like sort of infer the mentality of the people doing it. It's so alien to our way of thinking of things. This lack of deep time, everything we take totally for granted. This deep time. Now, okay, so priming us with that example, Hegel and the genesis of culture out of Kultur. So yeah, there was before, of course, Kultur, or which is sort of like there's a cultured person, and the cultured person is basically it's like great minds think alike, or whatever. To be cultured is one thing. It's everything unifies there. There's not. It would be like if you were to say there's not good, there's various goods. Or you're speaking of the principle, there's not civilization as a perfect thing. There's many different attempts, and they all probably, it sort of reminds, I guess, of that thing with I think it's one of the great Hindu gods, and then he's sort of who Joseph Campbell likens to Yahweh, in his magnificence is sort of ordering the buildings of great palaces and mansions, and with wonderful stone walls and so on, and wooden floors gleaming in the entryways, polished wooden floors. And he's admiring his great projects, as Herod admired his reconstruction of the Second Temple. Somehow, it's his pride and joy somehow. And then the blue boy says, "Oh yeah, but the other Yahwehs, they did it a little bit better than you do." What do you mean other Yahwehs? What do you mean? And then it's sort of like it doesn't make sense to say there's a bunch of different Yahwehs. It throws you into depression when you hear that. The same way there was originally Kultur, but then after Hegel, we're already on the halfway house into cultures, and then there's and then at length you get the university professors declare themselves the ones that know best about this. How do you call that? Culture war, culture comp. But there's some specific name in the Prussian time about the Prussian liberals pushing their some specific Kultur program or something like that, which then gives rights to that World War I's era story, because of course all these guys took part in World War One, where the playwright awards Hitler on his birthday with this beautiful play, Schlageter, I think it's called, about the guy that blew up a train in World War One. That line about the Browning pistol. I release the safety on my Browning pistol when I hear the word Kultur, because Kultur at the time was associated with the university professors who were pushing the so-called wertfreie Wissenschaft, or the value-free science, and they kept saying, what are you patriots talking about? You say you can produce history books, or you could produce your movies about Melania Trump or whatever, glorifying her, but actually this is not science. This is not honest. This is a value bias on it. So the liberals were denouncing the House of Hohenzollern, saying, and those conservative professors who were writing tracts that were favorable to them, as being unscientific propagandists, let's say. So that's sort of what was happening at the time. That followed on Hegel, who died in 1831. But then by 1914, you're getting this different situation, and then by 1930s, when Jost, I think it is Hans Jost, awarded Hitler that play, and then Hitler returned the compliment and awarded him some Führer Prize or something. So you could see that Kultur no longer existed in the sort of unified way I was trying to give with that Yahweh to the many Yahwehs version that takes the wind out of the current Yahweh and drives him into deep, profound meditations or whatever. According to, there's a little clip of Joseph Campbell telling that anecdote in a vivid way as he does. So when you have in Hegel these groups, this historical consciousness means we're suddenly aware that sometimes you hear professors say, were the Greeks really think differently than us? Were they really that different than us? You get this awareness that yeah, the Greeks had essentially different concerns. And then you could sort of ask the question, what was the essential thing people were all striving for circa some certain year? What was everything um, in its sort of the actual passions? Like yesterday we were talking about Rand Paul, who's recognizes intellectually that the U.S. is party to the UN and therefore to the ICC, but his passions aren't there. He doesn't really take it seriously. He says, no, we should get rid of this formal shackles and withdraw from the United Nations. The passions towards some project could be there, and the thinking process can then bring out sort of like, what were you guys all the time trying to do? So like, for instance, Heidegger says during German idealism, which is the time we're talking about here, there was a passion for systems. There's a passion for systems. Maybe after, so maybe but it still went on. Like there was like echoes of it still up to like Auguste Comte, it's a system of positivism. But now it's sort of dead. Nobody tries that anymore. Now everybody says there's these different fields. There's physics. I think even this division came out at that time when the systems, it came to a head. So people said there must be a system. And then, Hegel suffered this terrible blow, knockout. He becomes surely political and not really believed in. His concept, which had to do with his concept is still accepted. So it's still accepted that the Greeks really were different and striving for different things. The culture concept is accepted, but it transforms in its meaning. It's no longer part of this overarching architectonic structure, the Hegelian dialectic of history. It's no longer that there's different peoples with different concerns, and then in some way moved both by ideas and by how does Hegel's version of the invisible hand is called the cunning of reason. So the cunning is the sort of trait of a sociopath or of a brute, of an animal, Putin, or I don't say that in order to say I'm against Putin. I am actually against Putin because I think he's not good. He's not good for the Russians anymore. I think they should probably get a more wartime leader. But I'm not totally against Putin in the full sense because I know he was the savior of the Russians in the beginning of the 90s when he threw off the shackles of Berezovsky and what Yeltsin had descended into and so on. And what is probably, according to Jeffrey Sachs, what was thrust upon the Russians deliberately as it were, the wrecking of the will of the Atlantic Alliance, who believed that they had sort of survived a death match and had to therefore throttled their foe. They were still it's sort of like excessive police violence, maybe Rodney King or whatever. So we still have the culture concept that Hegel saw, and it's still basically, so that's interesting, I think, to see that the Geist notion that Hegel's talking about in Zeitgeist, one, it suggests, Zeitgeist itself suggests this interesting different form of thinking about time, because the Zeitgeist is not about a flat sort of first century, second century, this post-French Revolution version. metric system version of thinking in terms of centuries. I think it was like some Czech guy or something a few hundred years earlier that had come out with that notion of centuries rather than doing everything like according to the year of the death of Jesus or the year of the death of the monarch or something. Instead, like, oh, isn't it more neutral to just talk about centuries? But then we have to link it somehow. We had to link it to something. Yeah, to tether it, and then it ends up being tethered by that fun, this funny flip from Anno Domini to this Common Era speech, which also is a historical just accident, the way these things came in. And then, yeah, probably it was some professors put in the BCE language or whatever. Not exactly sure how far that part followed. That's irrelevant, though. But I'm just saying this, the way time is thought when we think it in that way, it seems like from 100 to 200, everything's happening on the Earth at the same time. But when you think about it in the zeitgeist sense, or the call it by other names, the Weltgeist and the Zeitalter. This type of way of thinking about time is more like this is when these priorities held sway with this country, or the using country is like a synonym for polis, so that it could cover almost anything, like this polis, this well, yeah, tribe is usually thought as, that's a big philosophic debate actually between Plato and Aristotle, whether the polis is, or country is just a larger tribe, or whether there's an essential difference. That's a philosophic question. But whatever this group is, it would sort of have its own, of course it has its own priorities, its own impulses and so on, its own, to use the Greek philosophic sense, its own ousia or nature. The things that it does when it's supposedly, according to Aristotle, not like, yeah, this funny way of talking, not interfered with, let's say, because it seems like, but it's the difference between external and coming from itself is hard to point out there, because it's what they're saying is more like something like if you have an orange tree in a certain part of northern Europe or something, then you want an orangery because it's gonna be too cold, and so the orangery is then, even though in one sense it's affecting it from outside or artificially or something, in the proper sense, this is what would be called, I guess because it's more intelligible, say it in Kant's way as autonomy, right? This would be the self movement of the life, or psyche, or according to its nature, or physis. That tree wants the warmth of the orangery. It doesn't want that cold, freezing weather, but either one we could think of as sort of being external. It aids the whole existence of the thing. Yeah, so the nature thought in Aristotle's way can be, despite the fact we call Aristotle a biologist all the time, it couldn't really be thought, it's a unifying principle. I mean, it everything that exists is understood to say this, everything. The reason that each thing is part of the same whole is because they're all part of one nature. They're all part of the same. I mean, that's what the concept of nature is like. So it's like, it has to, for Aristotle, it has to include the whole situation. So like whether it's a hothouse or not the hothouse makes a big difference. But when we say following its own, like this distinction between the the willing and the not willing is it's not really what we're talking about. Just as like in it's not a matter of an analysis of consciousness, intelligibility, and decision making and willing. We're just talking about the whole situation. That's sort of like, I mean, I guess that's obvious because there's a natural setting, there's a natural place for, you say this thing is in its natural habitat, right? So to say it's in the it implies that the environment and the thing are all thought together, but then there could be a jarring. And I think already this is what Hegel is talking about. When you're jarred out of that time, just as sort of the French and the Germans were sort of in their everlasting competitions, jarring one another in certain ways, showing each other mirrors, which could be unfortunate, right? So I think that's benefits us to understand Hegel in contact with the arising of our current concept of culture, which is culture as difference, which then, for instance, Dugin's basically, I mean, they call he's a sociologist, but he's also an anthropologist, basically. And yeah, this view, which is just it's held by every anthropologist, is inherited from this time when, I mean, it's not really adequate, right? Just to say, oh, because Hegel thought about it, because this guy and that guy thought about it. It's just the whole time period, and that's like Hegel's the more efficacious agent there, but there's the whole time period is sort of that's one of its necessities, to come into contact with this question and make it a factor in their existence, right? That's one of their and when we ask what the questions of, and so that's why Heidegger says, like, when we ask what the questions of German idealism is, we ultimately come to Schelling's freedom essay. And this was what, and in other words, what he's saying is, what the question about system, which which became a factor in their lives, of that, and of all those who lived in those generations, ultimately compelled them to reach this question about freedom, and that's what that whole age turned out to be about. And then, but for us, we don't have exactly the same exigencies, right? We don't have exactly the same factors in our existence, right? We haven't come into contact with exactly the same pressing necessities or questions which we can stand back and survey with sort of an interconnection and fascination. The questions that are more right for our time. Then, so you could see how this time and culture, where culture could be often presented as in a specific geographical area, specific bodies, specific people. This we always get in the liberal picture of things, this insistence that there's no such thing as a country, the Benedict Anderson stuff. Oh no, there's no country. There's only individuals or something. And this kind of, I mean, actually, somebody on the audience of the Lucy Hayes show charged me with that. But it's like, yeah, this is such a move through into Spinozaism. Okay, it's such a move. That's the other thing I should think is like, or one to think through with some benefit. I think that the Spinoza-ismist right or pantheismist right is totally preparing this all these reflections in Hegel, which Hegel just gives a kind of ordering to, and then he's without that much depth of as a historian, sort of brings out some things. I mean, where in the cases where you can give classical, where classical literature comes in, of course, then his very impressive. But then because his philology is good and so on. But in other cases about China or whatever, he's not really. It's not like Karl Jaspers or somebody who really knew his stuff. It's more just picking things to fit his overall system. But in any case, that whole thing is very fruitful for further reflection, I think. Superimposing these ideas and sort of enriching and getting to know better that whole time period, because in more than one way, not just in the material way of statues and buildings, but in many ways we are our history. And this is somewhat enigmatic in that we have all these different questions of how to understand that phrase. And it's not summed up just by, if you go look at what Hannah Arendt thought she meant by that, but it's also an open question, because this question's like, for instance, whether when we talk about our nature, we mean also the place, the country, for instance, where we grew up or where we feel to be in our natural place, as it were, and other such questions. The way we think about that is directly flowing out of this time, out of this font of the German idealist time and the Spinoza rise of the Spinozaism, which is a kind of already position, which historicism in a way, which says that those active forces that Hegel then tried to depict as they moved across to universal history were actually the motor. So because Spinoza in that sense was against saying dialectic as discussion, as giving definitions, or as epidactic speech, praising things, or persuading people through praise, or persuading people through giving sensible definitions or something. Spinoza saying no. This Hegelian, the side that then is developed in Hegel and others, was the main side, and then we got again another flip out of that, somersault into Marxism and so on, which is more dominant in our current day. But I think, it's ever sort of beneficial to weave this infinite combination in the near time, and not to sort of forget the strata in which our existence is unfolding.